Guten Morgen, everyone, and welcome back to Turtlecast. You're here with a very special guest, one of the finer minds in the world around property rights. And you know very well that here at Turtle, we speak about data in terms of a right of ownership because we fundamentally see it as an asset. And there's been a wonderful book that came out. It was called The Code of Capital, and it was written by Katharina Pistor. And I hope I got your last name correct. And it was actually quite fundamentally fabulous. And I had to ask her before the show what sort of feeling she has for the future. And it's a strong feeling that what we have in terms of law, code, policy, whatever you would like to call it, puts certain individuals on a path, and that path may not be beneficial for us going forward from the current trajectory we're on with how we sustain certain rights around capital itself and its ownership. So thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, most definitely. So just so we can kick this off, what was your incentive, your personal incentive to write this book?
You know, I think I wanted to show people the underbelly of the capitalist system. I think most people don't understand the inner working of the system because that is coded in law. It's just like you look at a human body and you don't see the DNA, but it's all about the DNA. And when I talk about the code of capital, I don't mean codification like a statute, but the process of coding capital, of creating new capital. And I think people have to understand this to understand where we are and where we might be going.
Right. And so, it really does bring some good understanding. You got some pretty heavy quotes in here. But the fundamental idea for this policy around assets is that you're trying to create conditions by which everyone should prosper, correct?
Yes.
And so what we found is that the code that is written, and much like a software program, it gets designed and redesigned over and over and over, trying to evolve with how society evolves. We found that the individuals that write that code have written it specifically for their benefit as the resource holders. So you can see that when wealth is created, the preservation of it typically tends to stay within those families or corporations, and it's backed by the states because they can help lobby and rewrite that code to continue to protect that wealth so that they can generate value from that asset for a longer period of time. And at the same time, it becomes very exclusive to those individuals that don't have that wealth but are trying to gain it. And the system becomes very imbalanced. The power asymmetry is there, making it difficult for them to even economically uplift themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly correct. And I think I really want to emphasize that this all works only because there is the backing of the state.
Oh, that's fire right there. Okay. So please explain to the audience what you mean by backing of the state.
Well, what is a property right? A piece of land is just a piece of dirt. You can grow, herd your cattle there, grow some plants on it. But if you want to exclude others from it without having your own private army, you need a title. And a title basically says you have the right to exclude others, and if they don't leave, we will back it. And we don't do this only with land, we do this for intellectual property rights, which are ideas propped up by law, which exist only in law. We do this with financial assets, which are contracts that you can enforce anywhere in the world because whoever buys them believes that they are ultimately enforceable. There's some validity to them that comes from the legal backing. So it's a social resource. It's the law that we're using to create private wealth. And so we have to think about how to balance that so it becomes not this one-sided reinforcement of existing wealth accumulation that you described.
Right. And, there's nothing wrong with reinforcing the accumulation of wealth. But when it's reinforced to one specific party or a very small subset of people, it makes it quite difficult for those other ones that want to garner those resources to become a part of that wealth generation. So when we look at the evolution, well, in my eyes, when I look at the evolution of assets and, the coding of this policy around capital, what it does is it has its own evolution for the purpose and benefit of a single few, but it doesn't have the code where it's actually inclusive for all. And there has been individuals that have tried, right? And I know you've named a few, but when we look at that, it's like, how do we take the evolutive steps within code, within policy, within contract law, right? To say this not only works for them, but it also works for everyone at the same time.
Yeah. Formally speaking, it should work for everybody at the same time. We
Right.
work in the legal system, in a rule of law based system. We say everybody's equal before the law, which, which does not mean that everybody has equal access to the law.
Right.
It also doesn't mean that everybody has equal access to regulators or the tax authorities to negotiate with them some exemptions or some soft spots where they can do stuff without being caught or being enforced against. So I think the issue is here that we have to move beyond this formalistic notion that everybody is equal before the law, and that's why it's just fine, and think harder about how some not only have more resources, but also have, then the resources to hire the lawyers who can exploit the most complicated intricacies and arbitrage opportunities that come from really knowing the details of the law, not only one legal system, but multiple legal systems.
Mm.
It also comes from the increasing ability to pick and choose your own law, right? You can be in New York, but incorporate your company in Delaware, or you can be, in Israel and incorporate your company in Delaware. And nobody in Israel has written the law under which you do your business in Israel. And so that's when these things fall apart, right? When the society has no longer control over the legal system that some exploit for their own private gains.
And so what they're exploiting is what we would coin the asset itself, right? And they live in this gray area of just saying, yeah, I know it's unfair, but it's legal. Does that mean it's the right thing to do? I mean, I understand that there's code and then you get state backing behind it. Well, it's like if the state doesn't have morals or ethics and these other individuals don't have morals or ethics and they're also writing that code, I don't think fundamentally that's a great path for us going forward in terms of our economies or human beings or even how we view other individuals' assets. It becomes very difficult to create an atmosphere of respect for those great resource holders if they live in this world of, oh, but it's legal.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So I think the mantra, it's legal, is something you hear a lot. You also hear a lot, especially from the finance industry, that they want to have legal certainty, right?
Mhm.
So that basically means we want to have very clear rules so that we can know how we can use them to our own benefits without facing costs that we can't predict from any kind of state intervention. And they also, of course, very often want certain exemptions from the law so they can do things legally that others cannot do legally. And these kind of legal privileges sort of add to the game. And I agree with you. In the long term, this really undermines our credibility in the legitimacy of the law. I mean, do we really believe the law is fair? If some can, game it, they really are gaming the law by basically saying we're exploiting every little gap in the scaffolding of existing regulations that we can find. And we're trying sort of to force this argument. It's only what we can sort of really nail down as a clear prohibition or something that would constrain us. And the rest we will use to fashion new types of assets as best as we can. And I think that's fundamentally a threat for both the rule of law and also democratic self-governance.
You know, oh gosh, that's right on point. You use the metaphor scaffolding, and I find that fundamentally interesting. Scaffolding goes on the outside of the structure. It's not really the meat and potatoes of what's going on here. It's also hollow. So, could you tell me why you chose scaffolding as a metaphor to describe that?
Quite frankly, a lawyer I teach with always explains to my students how you create new assets as a high-powered lawyer in a New York law firm.
Mhm.
You basically look at all the existing rules and regulations as the scaffolding, and you're finding a gap for your clients to go through. So you don't want to hit any of the pillars because that would mean it's illegal, it's void, and you don't get what you want. You want to fit these new things in the gaps between the scaffolding. And what sophisticated lawyers do, they know exactly how the scaffolding works. And they're trying to bend maybe some of those, but in principle, they're just trying to work in the gaps so that they can produce things that are legal, even if they violate the spirit. So when you talk about sort of the tissue in between, that should be
Mm.
the spirit. And you would hope that we respect that there's actually something of a purpose of the law that shall be, achieved. And of course, the law can never, ever be complete. So it will always, always have gaps. But if we tolerate sort of the gap exploitation for private gain, then we are reducing the law to a kind of scaffolding that is only basically a blockage, a barrier to achieve what you really want to achieve.
So was this your initial draw to law? Was the fact that it's this always evolving thing? It was always this, how do I move through this environment and find out where these points actually are? You're engineering the things that determine how society actually operates within its legal bounds and parameters. Was that something that really drew you into it?
No, because I was trained in Germany, and in Germany we're all trained to be judges, and we take the law it's given, and we enforce the law, and we have a very rigid doctrinal approach to applying it to cases. And when you do your first internship in a law firm in Germany, they basically tell you forget what you learned at university. You're now here to put yourselves into the shoes of the client.
Wow.
It's more the Anglo-Saxon spirit of the law, this engineering, this constant change. Also in the Anglo-Saxon systems, you become an attorney first, and you work as an attorney for many, many years before you're being appointed to the bench to become a judge. So the mindset is much more one of creativity, helping your client, rather than the top-down Germanic idea of you being trained as a judge. And when you are qualified to be a judge, you can also be a lawyer. So the lawyers are a little, sort of in the hierarchy of norms looked down on, and the judge is sort of the preeminent symbol of the legal system. So I wanted to be a judge. I started off thinking I would become a criminal judge, and then got interested in history and comparative law, and here I am.
I mean, you're talking about capital. I mean, that's somewhere where the biggest crime actually sits. So I think you're in the right wheelhouse, my friend.
Can we get into a little bit with, because you talked about new assets, and I want to get in, and you talk about it in your book too. I want to get into what you think with what's happening with decentralization, Bitcoin, because that's basically an asset, like, internet gold, whatever you want to talk about it. Do you see that as a revolution, or do you think it's not really anything?
I think it's more of the same, just with a new technology. So, credit or, debt assets have been created, since the 12th, 13th century, when we allowed actually to assign contracts. So, you have a note, you have a bill of exchange, you can dress this up further. And the Bitcoin is just, it's treated as just another thing. I think the original idea behind Bitcoin was to make it a kind of a currency, a trustworthy means of payment, right? But it's treated as an asset. You can debate whether it's speculative or not, because we're pricing it in dollars, and we're thinking about what are the future returns that I can get from this particular asset. And so the question is, what is the backing behind Bitcoin to give it that kind of value, right? And I think there is, of course, and I discuss a little bit in the book, is whether the digital code might be replacing the legal code. It's basically the opposite of what Larry Lessig has discussed years ago, where he said actually code is law, and I'm saying law is code. But of course that raises then the question, is the new digital code a potential alternative to the legal code? And to some extent I would say yes, because what is the legal code in the end? It's basically a collective commitment to stand behind a particular use of the collective means of coercion, right? So we pool our means of coercion together. That's what the state is. And then we design who has access to that centralized means of coercion under what conditions. And in Bitcoin, you're basically writing a digital code that pre-commits, and that is supposedly immutable. Maybe not entirely, but it's supposedly immutable, and that can be used to verify certain types of transactions. And we basically all commit to live by these rules when we use Bitcoin. So it's a rule-based system. And I think the idea is that if you hold these assets and these rules have value, it's the rules that give it in the end the value it has. It can be sold for a good price later.
Yeah, you use the word spirit. Do you think decentralization for inequality? Do you think that that spirit? Do you think that will last, or do you think the centralized identities will come in, swoop in, regulate it? What is your feeling on that?
Well, I think the big irony for Bitcoin is that it became valuable only once it was centralized, right? When Musk and other
Snap! You are sharp as a tack, aren't you?
Yeah, that's good. Yep.
Wow. You know, you said dirt, right? It's land. It's just dirt. But when a collective comes together and they say, hey, this is actually worth something. Now, I don't have a bunch of knights standing around in a field in my feudal system to protect my land.
Mhm.
So in cryptocurrency, I have an encryption system. That's
Mhm.
essentially my field of knights. So if they exist in code itself, well, then the security of that asset, the way I securitize it and protect it in this new digital evolving medium, this scaffolding is really a function of, well, how many people want to stand around the building holding the scaffolding up and say, okay, we like this encryption. It's that collective agreement that I think is the precursor to all value before something is an asset. Society would have to, a state can't come in and say, well, they could. They can say, oh, well, this is valuable and you have to value it. Well, people will be like, no, I don't want to value it. I want to value something else. So when the code follows what the state determines as value, I think that's the trajectory that's dangerous. Rather than saying the collective society has to come together and said, we have determined that this is something that's valuable to us. And I think that Bitcoin is not so much everybody's hyped up about the value of it as an asset. I think it's really more of a statement towards that trajectory which you are talking about. I think that's why it's had such a social calling and rise, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that, and I think it's sort of an aberration that it is used primarily as a speculative asset, or increasingly so, or maybe not primarily. But I think that's what it has become in some ways. But I agree with you. So I think collectively we could also decide to back other kinds of operations and basically write a code that could be much more decentralized and much more accessible by individuals and groups, associations that get together to use that resource. And the one thing I would say is, what the state basically does when it makes this kind of it makes a mandate that you value something like the state's currency, right? If it issues a
Yeah.
currency, what it really does then is basically says you have to use this because you have to pay your taxes in that currency. And when it issues debt, it basically says it levers our future productivity in a way, right? But whether we allow the state to do this and to what extent, and or whether we could think about a system where we can have a more decentralized coordination around this central resource, which is our commitment to live by certain rules. I think that's something that many people are looking for right now. I just finished reading the book by Ellen Landemore, Open Democracy. I'm not sure whether you've had her on the show, but that would
No,
be
she's coming on next now that you said that.
yeah, because she's basically rethinking democracy in those terms. How can you really have a more participatory arrangement with real people being there and not delegating all the power to some agents who make decisions that might not be aligned with the interest of people?
So, all right, this is interesting here. So, the state issues debt and then makes a requirement that you pay it back in what they determine as the nominal value in a specific currency on your future work. That's essentially what they're doing.
Yeah.
Now, from what I understand in what you wrote in your book is that, and this is not you who coined this definition, is that humans are often excluded from the definition of capital. And they cannot offer themselves as collateral and thereby monetize their own labor. Why is it that the state can monetize our future labor, but we can't monetize our own future labor as an asset? That is something that I think is fundamentally incorrect.
Well, I think actually we can capitalize our future labor. I think the impetus comes from basically a rejection of slavery. The idea that actually people have been used as collateral, people have been used as property rights, right? And so we're basically, are trying to say, I think people who are saying it can't be human are basically saying that's something that cannot be used as an asset, should not be used as an asset. But what you can do is you can set up a limited liability company. You commit in kind your labor and you pay yourself in dividends rather than income and you save taxes. And there are enough people who do that. That's a capitalization of your own labor. So the legal tools are there to do exactly this, and many people employ those legal tools to do that. I'm not sure whether this is what you have in mind, but I think when the state, or when you can also say a corporation, as a firm does the same thing. When it raises debt, it basically makes a commitment to pay back with future income, and the future income is produced by workers and the whole operation of the firm, etc. So pooling resources is, of course, critical for economic development. None of us has enough. Maybe some of the very rich ones have not enough to invest, but we want to pool. We want to also pool our commitment to a code, and we want to pool resources. The question is always, who then has the agency to commit on those resources, and what kind of mechanisms of accountability or actual participation do we have when these commitments are made?
So now that's in a very material sense, right? So I think in terms of policy and coding in the value of that capital against something material, it's not so nebulous. But then what happens when that begins to transition into things like property rights around ideas, intellectual property? It's a much more nebulous world. So how do we come together and collectively look at this and say this is an intellectual property right, and we would define it as an asset? Do you see that as a trajectory that will continue and actually grow as things become more digital and less material?
Well, I think other people have already argued and made the point that since the 1980s, the value of publicly traded firms comes mostly from their trademark, other intellectual property rights, or financial assets, all of which have their existence or owe their existence to the code, to the legal code, right? Intellectual property rights do not exist outside the law. And you can see this even if you read the US constitutions and the amendments, right? The property rights is assumed. Just say property rights are protected. You can't take property away without just appropriate compensation. But there's a provision in the Constitution that says Congress shall make a law about intellectual property. You have to make that. It doesn't exist. With land, we can still have the idea. I think it's a wrong idea, but it's something, an object out there that is not assetized or commodified or not coded. In truth, I think it becomes property only once you have the legal code, and ideas become assets only once they're legally coded. Where you draw the line here is always a big question, because I think especially in a world where most assets are actually owe their existence to that code, the question is how far do we want to go? Because if you have access to the coding, you create the assets that you can then dress up further in the law, and that's how you that's how you create wealth. So what you can patent, whether it's the genetic code, whether it's just organizational stuff, filing systems. Google is a filing system, got a patent for it. Should it have? We can debate that. It's now a little late,
Yeah.
but these things were debatable. The point is that we have seen this very strong push, especially in the United States, but in a competitive capitalist system, the push is always to grant more rights to those who promise that they can make value out of that, right? And so again, sort of having access to the coding is the key to wealth.
So really then, when someone is investing with any great sense, you're not really investing into the company, you're investing into the state and them supporting the code that supports the company.
Yeah.
That's going to shake some people up. So, I'll explain to you, for us here at Tartle, we afford people in 222 countries the ability to take their data and put it into a fungible, tradable asset that has a market value price to it. And we are doing this before there is any code that supports it. We support it with a human code and respect that when I go to acquire data, I know that the genesis of it comes from an individual, right? And so we ask in our marketplace that those people that come in to buy it respect that aspect and treat it as such, as an asset. And much of that is an intellectual property right, but we see it as a human right, like your right to your thoughts. So what's your kind of take on what we're doing if we're sitting in this very nebulous realm where there is no code truly supporting what we're doing, but there's a great agreement across 99% of the countries in the world where people are like, yeah, this is something where we collectively come together and say, this is a valuable asset to us. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think before we had the state with the centralization of the means of coercion, and even within the state, we do a lot of things by simply abiding by social norms, getting together as groups that commit to certain ways of doing things. And we internalize certain norms as we grow up. But even beyond that, we can create new clubs, associations, parties, whatever, where we agree together to certain types of norms. And then the question is, how far can you go with this? How much can you scale this up? I think historically the state was really, in the state's law, was the most important social scaling technology. Because information costs were high, right? So, but if you have an authority, a state that is powerful, that backs what you have, then people start respecting that. And if the state then really makes good on those promises, I think with the reduction in information costs, with information technology, where people can communicate across state borders very easily, can commit to certain things, and you might even be able to monitor whether they commit. I'm not sure what you do when people violate your rules. Do you expel them? That would be a classic enforcement device, right? You don't put them in prison, you expel from the community.
Correct.
You ostracize, reputation damages. These kind of things are well known from the literature, and these are social norms that work really well if you have the information, access to information, you can monitor, and you have some mechanisms to ensure that people comply.
Would you like to know how the mechanisms work? Because you might find this interesting.
Yes.
So, for instance, if somebody tries to do something that would be, albeit inappropriate, or try to do any sort of market cornering or abuse the nature of how this system works, it's a very laissez-faire model. The seller and the buyer on both sides of this marketplace have the ability to block the individual from interacting with them again. So now, say for instance, the government of India comes in to buy data from many other countries, say from 10 million individuals. Well, if they do something inappropriate or actually try to shortchange people or try to abuse them, and not look at them with the appropriate value, those 10 million can choose to block India altogether. And that same power is also vice versa for the others. So if somebody is just trying to falsify things over and over and over, then the larger aggregate buyers can come in and say, we should not buy from this person. We should exclude them from participating in this system. And then we, as the monitoring third party, can even stop people from coming in that may be bad actors in the first place by screening them out of that.
Yeah. So I think these are mechanisms that you would find elsewhere as well. It's ostracization, basically. It's and a certain, it's in the Middle Ages when the state wasn't very powerful yet. You basically create, you make somebody basically an orphan in the law. Everybody can enforce against that person. You can even kill people without facing sanctions yourself. So I think
we're not killing people here. We're just preventing you from participating in the marketplace. That's all.
But that's it. Basically, you're banned from the community or in one way or another. And it works. The question has always been, can this work at scale?
Yeah.
And the historical examples that people point to are middlemen who have this information, very often ethnically homogeneous middlemen who can monitor each other, and then they share information, so you can't trade with these guys, right? And nowadays you do something similar as you monitor the process, but we have much better access to information and can respond much easier. So I think these kind of mechanisms become available again to us because of the technology we have today.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. As technology is developing, and you speak to this code, and I feel like we and what we are doing and all the participation of people all over the globe are going to be the ones that end up writing that code, or the states will look at what we are doing and then have to write the code off of the processes that what the globe has said, this is what we fundamentally see this value in. And it's a very cross-border thing. So I think it's going to create some very interesting scaffolding in which individuals will look at that and be like, I wonder where these property rights sit, how this should operate, and how this affects many other different markets. Because when we look at it, for a long time, people have been taking the value of data, these larger resource holders, Google, for instance, and holding all that value for themselves. The code for them said, we never had to share that value to anyone. And there's still, that code really isn't there. So when we saw it, we're like, this is an obvious asymmetry. So our arbitrage was to say, well, that scaffolding sucks. Let's just rip it down altogether and start building up our own. And then from that, they would have to, work within the means and ways of which this marketplace operates itself. So I think the metaphors that are carried for how you say the code is really evolving capital, I think is so fundamentally interesting, and not the vice versa approach. So I sincerely appreciate the take that you have on that. And I think it's a strong trajectory going forward for us to say, let's look at how that code evolves, and let's apply that code to not just look at it for the power of the state, but the power of all.
Yeah, I think in principle, in a democratic state, we should think of the state as the power of all. But it has been perverted to some extent, right? It has been so centralized and captured by fundamental interests, and so the way out of that may very well be exactly what you're doing: decentralize, find new ways of committing and monitoring a code that offers an alternative to what the current practices is.
Yeah, I love that. And I needed some clarification on this because I don't understand and I'm unlearned in this part. You said two legal systems dominate the world of global capital. That's English common law and the laws of New York State. Could you just give me some insight into what that means, just for my own curiosity?
Yeah, no, it's when you think about globalization, people very often think this is outside existing
Mhm.
nation states and something's happening out there in the economies. In fact, the economic relations between companies or financial asset holders are legally coded. The question is only in which legal system. And so because you need the enforceability, you need the credibility of some power that stands behind it. And it doesn't really happen through the harmonization of law. So states don't get together and write a new code for contract law. That doesn't exist in the international sphere. They just respect certain things. Every state has its own set of rules. We call them conflict of law rules or choice of law rules, where they basically advise their judges under what conditions they can enforce foreign law in their own courts. So somebody who has written a contract under French law that comes to an American judge, can they enforce French law in an American court? Under certain circumstances, they can. These rules can be used to then basically harness the powers of a particular legal system by advising clients choose that law, right? So for finance, for international trade, because of the way the law has developed, the friendliness of judges towards commercial activities, etc., and because of also the lawyers who have been very active there, most of the choices that are being made are made in favor of one of these jurisdictions. So New York for contract law, Delaware for corporate law, English law, very powerful as well for many transactions. So you would not choose some obscure little legal system. You wouldn't choose one where it's hostile to the whole idea of coding and creativity in the law. And you hope, what the lawyers will tell you is whether that contract that you're now writing in English law will be enforceable in a German court. And that's sort of the job that lawyers do. And by stitching together transactions in different legal systems, very often in those two, you can create basically a global system. Most of the tradable assets today, from sovereign debt of emerging markets to all kinds of debt instruments and their derivatives, are coded in English or New York law. And they're enforceable in English and New York courts, but many of them would also be enforceable in a court elsewhere. It's a patchwork in a way. It's not an integrated global legal system. We don't have a global state. We don't have global law, right? That's how we put these things together.
So is it enforceable because even people in Australia could own American debt? So it would essentially have to be enforceable because of the medium in which this thing is transacted and can be held cross border. So then we're like, well, I guess the patchwork means that what upholds in the US is also going to have to uphold in Australia. Is that how that would work?
Yeah, that's basically why individual countries have changed their conflict of law rules such that they have become more and more open to respecting foreign law within their own jurisdiction, even on matters that are sensitive. So, for example, what is a property right? Used to be entirely, a matter of state law, because what is on your territory, everything that's located here, the state would say my property regime will govern. But financial assets don't have a location. Right. So,
No.
so then you have to find a different rule, and the rule is basically, wherever you issue these assets, and then you choose the place where you issue the assets, and then you have the law, and then it becomes portable.
Yeah, you used the word. I want to get into this because this was very interesting in the book. You used the word obscure law earlier, and NAFTA, and then you talked about the tribunals. Can you explain that? Because to me, that seemed very, very scary.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting evolution, it started really with NAFTA in a big way. That sovereign states enter into contracts with one another. We call this international law, and in those international law contracts, to which only sovereign states can enter into, they empower private parties to sue one state in a private arbitration tribunal if an investment is infringed, right? So some of the investment, you can understand that states want to say, don't expropriate our companies that come to your shore. We can understand that. It's another issue to say, and if you do something that looks like an infringement, my company or the company from my country can take you, sovereign state, into private arbitration, and you have to pay up. Now, why do states pay up? They could decide not to. Most states pay up because they're afraid that they won't have foreign capital inflows anymore if they don't. But the implication of this model has been that since the 1990s, late 1990s, we have had a proliferation of bilateral investment treaties between sovereign states, empowering firms from their own countries to be protected when they enter other countries. And so we have also seen the proliferation of state or investor-state disputes, which are resolved by private arbitration tribunals that don't have to look at the local law in the country that is affected by it. They only look at the international treaty, which happens to be relatively thin, and with the right interpretation gives the investor a lot of rights. There are really interesting developments here. I listened to a webinar yesterday about the Energy Charter Treaty, which basically protects oil-producing companies, which are using these provisions to take countries to arbitration for damages if they adopt climate change protecting legislation, because it affects their property rights.
Me?
No, I'm not kidding you. Hundreds of millions of dollars, because it's considered a regulatory taking. They're basically, and it
they're
basically
feeling like they're being infringed upon their business practices.
Yes.
If somebody chooses to adopt something that's for the climate.
Yes.
I'm going to throw this table right now out the window of the studio.
So how does that work? Like, especially on the tribunal side of things, because it seems like you're just being able to alter law.
Yeah. And does that mean the state's like nervous? They'll end up losing funding from these larger oil corporations, which really do generate a lot of income for that state?
Yes.
Well, that puts a lot of pressure.
They will not even start doing anything, because that's basically, it's preemptive. The power to bring these suits preempts very often legislation, especially in poorer countries.
What do? How are you supposed to get anything done then? I'm all upset.
On top of that, even if so most of these treaties last only for 10 years, but they very often grandfather the protections that you have granted for another 10 years. So we have basically, this was the idea of the 1990s. The markets know better. So you empower private actors, and you empower private actors against state actors. So our political coordination to say we have to now do something about climate change may very well be slowed down and made much more costly, because powerful investors will bring these kind of suits. And so the lawyers on the side of trying to protect the climate are all trying to work out possible solutions, but there's no easy one.
Oh, great. So why don't we just grandfather in 5 treaties, which accumulates to 50 years, and by that time we got no atmosphere left.
Here we go.
Right. That is just horrific to hear something like that. So then, are there examples in the past where things, not specifically, climate related things, but where someone has come up against this? What was the catalyst that truly effectuated the greater change that needed to happen, even when there were actors that didn't want that change to occur? Are there any great examples of that?
Yeah, but unfortunately, only major crises, which we don't really like to have. But one example is, which I discuss in the book, is the major depression in agriculture in England in the 1870s. That finally gave rise to a reform of property rights, which they had debated for the entire 19th century, and they could implement only after that. So I think, unfortunately, because vested interests have so much power, and many don't want to rock the boat, and we all are afraid of a real crisis because we don't know how we can come out of it. That we delay and hope that we can prevent the crisis, but we don't change the system. And if we don't change the system, we will basically end up in the crash at some point.
Yeah, it's bound to happen regardless.
Yeah, and you talk about in the book, and I'm going to read this
Yeah.
part because I think it's really cool. You said the lure of money and the temptation to create more of it can fuel growth and wealth, but if pushed too far, it can have corrosive effects on the economy, bouts of hyperinflation in some. Do you see that that's what's going on right now?
That's a delicious statement, by the way. Very well written.
Thank you. I'm not afraid about inflation right now, so I think that's a little bit hyped up. I think
No
that
pun intended.
huh?
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
I'm
Yes.
sorry. I'm shameless. I can't help myself.
Yeah. I think, in a way, to some extent, I would say that the continuous support by central banks of private assets, even years and years after the crisis, was probably more dangerous for our system than a massive influx of public money to get out of the COVID crisis. That is much more widely spread and helps also smaller businesses and families rather than only the big asset holders. But I think that one of the big problems that we have to get over is that after the 2008 crisis, we did not really reconfigure our financial system, but supported it. And whenever the market threw a little tantrum, the central banks, backstopped it again. And so the reliance on that kind of, social resource again, our money system is also a social resource, has created even more private wealth on that end. And I think that is ultimately politically much more problematic than the public money right now.
That's incredible. And so, when you're teaching your law students and you're writing your book, what is it that you really, at the end of their semester, or when I get to the end of this book, what is it you really wanted to leave with them or the readers as a message for them to carry forward in their lives?
Yeah, I want them to understand that law is malleable, that you can be creative with it, but that also if you pursue only one path, it can really be really dangerous for society. I think most lawyers are trained to become such sophisticated technicians that they don't see the social impact of
Mm.
what they're doing. And I know that they also work in law firms where they are incentivized in such a way that that's what they do, right? The promotion system and all that, it works. It's very hard for them to keep an eye on the social implications. But I want at least to assure that they try. So I do teach corporations. I teach U.S. corporations. I teach them what the law is that they have to master. But almost in every case, you could debate it this way or that way, and you can make decisions that have that implications or this implications. And so just opening more avenues for different perspectives is what I try to do, and especially this broader vision, not this very narrow silo vision.
No, I love that. And, we all feel that it's just so fundamentally important to really look at those social implications. They should give B Corp certifications to specific lawyers. Oh, you're doing this for people. You're really doing it for society and the planet. I'm going to give you a B Corp stamp. I think, I think that sort of approach is one that we need. I think it's one that will help preserve us as a species if we take on that evolutive attitude of, is it really of a great benefit for society or a select benefit of the few? And the way that you've shared this, articulated it, detailed it, and helped us walk us through how these technicians actually work, create wealth, and then preserve that wealth, I think it enlightened me enough to the fact where I cannot wait to share this information with many other people that I come in contact with. And I got to tell you, I would have loved to have had you as a professor. If Columbia would have ever accepted me, I'm not that intelligent, but I would have loved to have had you as a professor, hands down.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one last question because you have this is your last statement in the book.
Hit it.
If these trends continue, naked power once more gain sway over legal ordering, as it's done over most of human history, and we'll all be worse off for it. So it's kind of like to me, it seemed kind of bleak. Is that what you see? I mean, that's your last statement in the book. Does it look bleak for us?
It is a little bleak in the book, and I'm wrestling with that. So I think one of the, I'm a positive person in principle. I'm sort of more a sunny person than a dark person. But the conclusion I couldn't really escape from the book. So, I still believe that large, complex social systems need codes that they agreed to. And maybe you're creating something that is really an alternative, but as long as we live with the law, we have to make sure that this law serves all of us, because it is also a fragile system. It only exists and is functionable if it's credible and legitimate in the eyes of the people, not in the eyes of those who want to use it for their own purpose. And if you destroy this before you have any alternatives, then what's left? Then you have naked power, right? And we've been in societies like that. So the amazing thing is that for centuries, of course, we've had wars and destruction and horrible things as well, right? But the amazing thing is that we have created economies that have produced so much wealth, and private wealth, but also national wealth and prosperity for so many. And so we have to think about how to protect that resource, this collective resource. And I think that is going off the rails, and that's a real danger.
So now that I got goosebumps running up and down me, where is it that individuals would go to purchase your book, find out more about you, maybe try and apply to your class at Columbia? Because if they don't, it'd be a really stupid choice not to. I think everybody should probably take it. Just after talking to you, I could probably talk to you for a couple more years to try and figure out how I can put my head on straight. Where would they go to find out more?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on Facebook. That's basically probably one way to find out more about me. I have a faculty page, but I'm sort of not that sort of present in social media. I've written this book. You can find on YouTube and other channels, other lectures that I've given about the book and related stuff. So I think if you just Google Google me, as we say, all subject to the same, digital coding devices to get the information. But yes, I think you should find more.
Well, that's amazing. I'm really happy that your life path has brought you from Germany here to the United States. I think this is just fundamentally so enlightening, and I really want to thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.